Hello and welcome to the 21st Century Work-Life podcast, where we talk about leading remote teams, online collaboration, and working in distributed organizations. This podcast is brought to you by Virtual Not Distant, where we help managers and teams transition to an office-optional approach. Find out everything we do over at virtualnotdistant.com and check out our show notes and pictures of our lovely guests over on the podcast page. It's great to have you here, listeners. Let's get on with the show. Hello and welcome to another episode of the 21st Century Work-Life podcast, where we talk about leading remote teams, online collaboration, and working in distributed organizations. And today we are talking hybrid. And well, I'm sure my guest will have lots to say about this as well, but for us at Virtual Not Distant, we continue to see hybrid as a subset of remote work. And when I say we, I mean others at Virtual Not Distant, but also other people in the remote advocacy space. And and so what best person to have expand on this theme than Laurel Farrer? Hello, Laurel.
Hello, Pilar. It's so nice to be here again. Always love our chats.
So for those of you who don't know her, Laurel is the CEO and founder of Distribute Consulting, and she's also a regular Forbes contributor. And in fact, much of today's episode, Laurel, you've made my life so much easier by having an article that we could hook the conversation around, because this is a big thing. And Laurel, of course, she's also an international remote work expert. And if you can explain this LinkedIn tag, which I really like, you say that you leverage the power of workplace flexibility to impact business operations and socioeconomics. Laurel, Please explain.
Yes. Well, this is actually where the name Distribute came from when I was starting my business. Yes, we are distributing people, right? We're known as distributed teams because we're not centralized. But I also love the play on words that we're also distributing opportunities to people that wouldn't normally have access to sustainable employment or have access to growth opportunities within their organization or the opportunity to stay employed if they needed to move away from a certain area. So yes, this is one of the most passionate reasons that I love remote work, is because this is so much more than just a convenience for people to be able to live a more flexible lifestyle. Remote work at its core is about changing the way we work, and in so doing, also changing the world on an economic level. It's very, very exciting.
And so that's why it was time to have you back. So listeners, Laurel was part of episode 212, Remote Work for Social Change. And she also contributed quite a lot to the loneliness and connection and disconnection series. And also, we've also got you talking about information isolation. So do you think, Laurel, before we go into the meat of the episode, well, actually, I feel like the agenda of using remote work for socioeconomic change to distribute opportunity, I love that. Do you think that's been lost during the pandemic, and do you think we can recuperate it?
That's a very good question, because as you know, and I know, but a lot of other people don't, what was happening during the pandemic was not remote work at all. This was an international contingency plan to maintain business continuity during a global crisis, right? So it was not workplace flexibility in its optimal form. And so because of that, we're starting to see a lot of controversy about, did this help or did this hinder socioeconomics, right? Like, I think restaurants are a very great example of this, that they're like, oh, the restaurants died because of remote work. And we're like, no. Restaurants died because of the pandemic, because of social distancing, because of health precautions. It had nothing to do with remote work. In an optimal state, remote work and workplace flexibility can actually stimulate local restaurants on a higher level. So what we're seeing during the pandemic is not typical. And so we as frustrating as it is to not have 2 years of data to rely on,
Mm.
we kind of do need to start fresh in our opinions from this point forward to identify, is this good or is this bad for our local economy? And chances are, in most lanes of both society as well as economics, it's going to be an improvement just because the circumstances of the pandemic were so extreme.
I another sidetrack, but I'm so glad you brought up the point about restaurants, etc. Because also the rhetoric that I've heard as well is that in office centers, a lot of hospitality business was suffering. But actually, if you look at the coffee shop across my street, I live in a neighborhood that's a little bit outside of center of London. That one was thriving. So I think that there's been a shift even in that industry of who were the people who were doing well and who were the people who unfortunately had to close down.
Absolutely. Yeah, we just can't make blanket statements because this is such an unprecedented phase of history. We need to stay very level headed and open minded as we form opinions.
Yeah, thanks. Thanks for that. And so, starting to go into hybrid, how do you see hybrid emerging and how do you see it becoming part of or independent of the whole remote work sphere? I mean, this is a very broad thing, but just
Mhm.
what are some of your thoughts around that?
Right. Well, I think the most common myth that I used to hear from employers and still do most often as they're considering whether or not they should adopt a hybrid model is that this is being driven by workforce requests. And I think that that's one of the most interesting statistics that I have access to with our internal research and data and case studies here at Distribute is that the workforce requests and the number of professionals in accelerated economies and the in North America as well as EMEA, the number of requests from professionals that want to work remotely and want to have access to workplace flexibility has not changed. It is the exact same number from 2015, 2017, 2020, 2022, that number has always stayed almost exactly the same. In fact, it's decreased just a tiny bit since the pandemic has started. So what's changing is not the number of professionals that are asking to work remotely. What's changing is their negotiation power. So what's changing is the employer's ability to have excuses of, no, this doesn't work for us, or no, that's not a possibility. Now that ball is in the court of the employees as they can say, you can't tell me that this is not possible. I just proved that it was possible for 2 years. It kept our business alive. I was productive. Now what's your excuse? And the employers don't have any. That's what's changing in hybrid teams is it's not being driven by the workforce requests, but that's what's cornering the employers in order to make this decision and to really identify and admit that, yes, this is a possibility. So, what we're watching is a lot of employers feeling very pressured and feeling very backed into this corner. And if we make decisions from that place of fear and stress and pressure, it's not going to be a successful or sustainable change for the organization. We need to make sure that leaders understand how beneficial this is so that they have leadership support. Because if they're coming at this change from that place of fear, they're always going to be resentful. They're always going to be resistant of, oh, I was forced into this and I don't like this. And as soon as this trend passes, we'll get everybody back into the office. And it's always going to keep them in a negative mindset. So the more that leaders can open their minds and understand the incredible organizational benefits of flexible working, the more that they will feel motivated in order to want to make this change for the company's benefit, not just the workforce's benefit. So that's where they can start to see the value of things like productivity increases and real estate and overhead cost decreases and more efficient output and just more streamlined software expenses. I mean, there's huge financial benefits that organizations can access if they do it the right way. But if they come into it begrudgingly and, with the minimum level of effort, they'll never see those benefits. So they have to do it the right way.
Thanks for that. Laurel, because you're mentioning so many things and the importance of that mindset in which we're coming to it. Like you say, and I agree with you that I'm also hearing, I hadn't actually thought of fear, but just resentment in a way that, oh,
Mm,
we've got to do this or else. And what you mentioned, which I don't think I've heard or read before, but the nuance of it's not that there's more requests, but it's now actually that now it's very difficult to turn them down just because we think it's not going to work.
mhm,
And I think that that is really important to understand if we want to move forwards also as a society, that this is not that everyone wants to work away from the office now, which is what we're being led to believe sometimes, that we just consume a lot of articles. But it's actually that has not increased, and that's really important because it means that still a lot of people want to go into the office, and we've got to acknowledge that. But that
mhm.
is so interesting, the fact that what's changed is that actually it's now very difficult to put a case against the fact that I can do it like that. Oh, thanks, Laurel.
You're welcome.
So with all of that, I thought we could hook the following conversation. It makes perfect sense alongside one of your recent, not your most recent. I mean, we're recording 10th of March, so it's not your most recent article, but one of them. And the title is 10 Habits to Ensure Equality in Your Hybrid Team. And it's in Forbes.com, and it's from the 20th of January 2022. And I thought that rather than going through the 10, because also listeners can have a good read of the article, I picked some themes and I thought I'd just ask you to share those. And actually, the first one that I've got in my notes is actually mindset. And you've already started to touch on it. And it covers some of your habits, one of which is adjust productivity tracking, and 10, seek frequent feedback. Can you speak a little bit more about those two?
So, management resistance is always a common barrier to success in any change management process. However, when we're talking about adopting a flexibility model specifically, it is by far, I mean, like way, 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 way far, huge gap here. I can't emphasize that enough. I'm talking with my hands a lot, but you can't see it.
We can see that. We
But
can see
yeah,
that.
yeah, hear it in my voice.
Yes.
It is so far the number one barrier to success in adopting remote work is management resistance and leadership support. This, if anything is going to go wrong in your company becoming a hybrid or distributed team of any model, this is what is the most likely to go wrong. Especially because we have this return to office messaging that's happening all throughout our society of it's time to get back to work and we got to
Mm.
go back to the office, and that it has tones within it of, well, we haven't been working for the past 2 years. So anybody that is willing and prepared and supportive of coming back into the office, like our mid-level managers and our executives, the people that are coming back into the office, those are the ones that are really loyal to the brand. Those are the ones that are really going to be productive and are supportive of the company getting back on track. And that's just ridiculous. Like, first of all, that is completely insulting to your hundreds of employees that have just worked so hard during an unprecedented emergency to keep your business alive in very stressful circumstances. But it also creates a discrepancy of people that are in the office are harder workers and the people that are out of the office are not working. They're out of sight, out of mind. And there's a disconnection in loyalty and a disconnection in productivity. And it just creates a huge biased mess. And this is where the term proximity bias comes into play, right? That the people that are closer to you are perceived as more valuable. So, what we want to do is prevent that from happening. And this circles back to exactly what you were talking about in the beginning, how hybrid work and remote work are very closely related. That's another myth and misunderstanding that a lot of employers talk about and ask questions to me about is, well, no, hybrid and remote are two different things. We're not a remote team. We're a hybrid team. So I think it's important to clarify the context here that if we want to be successful as a hybrid team, we have to operate as a remote team. that's why they are so closely connected, is because if we are a hybrid team, and some of us go back into the office and some of us don't, and there's this proximity bias that comes into play, and employee experience is different for those people that are in the office and those people that are not, that is not sustainable. That's exactly the error that we saw companies make in the 90s, like IBM and Yahoo, that had to retract their policies. That's why they had to retract them, because they continued to maintain location as part of the equation. That they were concerned about where you were. So the solution is to stop talking about location, to stop worrying about location completely, and to say, well, no matter where you are, whether you're in the office or in a home office or a client's office or wherever, a co-working space, no matter where you are, we are empowering you to be equally as productive, equally as recognized, equally as creative as you possibly can be, because work is something that we do, not somewhere that we go. So the more that we can, as hybrid teams, employ the principles of virtual first mindsets and fully distributed operations that don't have location as part of the operational equation, that is exactly where we will see the success.
And you're right. I mean, thank you, thank you for that again. The location is leading the conversation. How many days in the office? How many days at home? So that's not what we're trying to go. And also, I think that for me, the office is not a location; it's a tool. It's an enabler of doing certain kinds of work and having certain kinds of conversations and types of connections. If the place plays such an important part in our conversation, we're never going to be happy. Yeah. One thought as well. Have you come across, because I hear a lot when we're looking at proximity bias and who's being left out, it's usually the remote workers in the conversation. But I'm actually thinking that we could also flip it. And in some
Yes.
organizations, the remote workers might be having a much better time than the people in the office. Have you seen this or thought of it? I mean,
Oh,
yeah.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Yeah. Laura Owen, who used to be the head of people ops over at GitHub, which prior to the pandemic was one of the largest hybrid teams in the world, she talked about this extensively, and she called it the great coffee versus pants debate, because one or the other, either the on-site workers or the off-site workers, were always going to be unhappy. So the on-site workers were saying, oh, you remote workers, you don't even have to wear pants. You've got it made. But then the remote workers were saying, oh, you people on site, you get free coffee and you've got an in-house barista. Like, you guys have it made. So no matter what, the grass is always going to be greener. And so, yes, this is the eternal struggle with hybrid teams, is making sure that everybody's happy and that everybody understands that there are pros and cons to both sides. So honestly, a lot of directors of workplace flexibility or heads of remote that work with large hybrid teams, they really do need to be playing a very strategic peacemaking role and making sure that everybody understands why their roles are designated to be where they are and why we're asking people to come back and forth between the office. That, I think, is the greatest conversation that's missing, because so many employers are just so tired of change management that they're just like, okay, we're going to make this as easy as possible. Everybody come into the office, at least 2 days a week, come and go as you'd like. There you go. Like, they feel like that is empowering their workers as much as possible, but it's not, because what's going to happen, and what does happen already that we work with our clients, is that the workers, not understanding exactly which tasks are supposed to be done on site and which are not, they start to make decisions based on personal factors, like, oh, Thursday I've got to, pick my kid up from karate that's down the street from the office. And so I'll go into the office on Thursday. So they do their normal work that they usually would at home in the office on Thursday. And then what happens? They sit down at a desk with nobody around and they're just working independently, and they start to feel very resentful because they're like, well, why in the world am I here? I'm working alone on my laptop just like I would be at home. This is a waste of time. This is a waste of money. And I'm bitter that my employer is requiring me to be here for no reason. So, what we need to do instead is have very, very clearly recorded and very transparent conversations about when is the best time to come into the office and what types of tasks are better done at home. So we can start to create a new type of value for the office. And most employers are seeing that that is collaborative work. So we come together, we get to have the classic whiteboarding experience. We have a lot of group conversations and creative conversations and culture development activities in the office. And then at home, that's when you get your asynchronous, independent tasks completed, so that there's a division of there's value in each type of environment. And the entire premise of remote work and of workplace flexibility is that you get to choose the type of environment that is right and best for each type of task that you need to complete.
Excellent. And so we're almost in the second, you've taken us into the second area that I wanted to look at, and it's these blending workspaces. You've got a couple of points around standardizing a meeting experience, designing consistent workplaces, and coordinating team schedules. Can I ask you to expand on designing consistent workplaces?
Yes. So there, we just have to realize that everything that we know about business is a derivative and a byproduct of hundreds of years of experience, right? Since the Industrial Revolution, we have been working together in co-located environments. And so we have to recognize just how many factors are very, very innately designed and just inherently designed into our experiences. One of those is workplace safety. Workplace health and safety is so carefully, very, very meticulously controlled and inspected and enforced in office environments. So, health and safety regulations have existed for about 50 years by now. Workplace accidents, injuries, and illnesses have been cut in more than half since then. And so these little decisions in office environments about like how bright the lights are and how tall the desk height is and what length the carpet is and how far away the bathroom is from the elevator, like things that we never think about as employees, but all of those are very, very carefully designed and inspected for our protection. And all of those things make us inherently more productive because we work in that type of environment. So when we go from that very carefully curated bubble of incubated productivity and we go into our home environment and we work on a beanbag all day and we're slumped in our chair, we're not taking breaks, we're not getting exercise, there's lower natural light, there's lower air circulation. All of those things mean that physiologically we're not able to be as productive. And then you add on top of that the fact that we're working on, a cheap $100 laptop and we're working on spotty internet at the coffee shop and there's blenders in the background. Like, how can we possibly measure the performance of one employee that is working in meticulously designed environment and another one that is working against technology and environment and physiological barriers and measure their performance equally? It's just ridiculous and completely impossible and will be a contributing factor to discrimination in the future, especially over time. So we need to make sure that as we are having conversations about workplace, it's not just, work from anywhere you want. It's like, no, we need to still be very careful in making sure that our employees are safe, that they're supported, that they are working in conditions that will support their mental clarity and focus, that they are able to access information and files and resources and other people just as much as their counterparts on site are able to do. We really need to think about how to equalize those workplaces, not only for the sake of, employment perks, but most especially for the sake of equal performance measurement.
Yeah, and I think at the same time, this is such an important set of factors and even conversations to have also when we're looking at asking people to come and use the office as well,
Mhm.
because immediately as you're talking as well, I'm thinking temperature. For
Yes.
example, I'm always cold in offices because there's aircon. There's no aircon in my home. I love it. It's so great. And things that you're talking like desks, having proper, if we are going for the hot seating option, having
Mhm.
proper setups. My husband was telling me about he's not a knowledge worker, but they've got an area for hot desking, not hot
Mhm.
seating, hot desking. And there's nothing to make it comfortable for yourself. Whereas I remember working in an organization that had activity-based working where the desks were adjustable, they had proper monitors, you just logged yourself into the computer, and it was all designed so that you had the flexibility of working from different places. But as you say, so much thought had been put into that experience.
Mhm.
So I think as well that we need to understand sometimes why people would prefer to work from home.
Mhm.
And as you say, give them all those, making sure that they're safe and using the workspace properly, and also understanding and not missing out on the opportunity of the office being more comfortable, so that people don't want to work from home because they're not comfortable in the office. They might
Mhm.
be dying to be surrounded by people and they might not mind actually the noise, but actually the chair's not comfortable, or the temperature, or there's something in the air that makes them uncomfortable. I think it's another opportunity to be more inclusive of people who actually before haven't even thought about why they weren't comfortable there.
I love that. Yeah, it's such a profound conversation, isn't it? Right?
Mm,
What changes can we make to our environment to make it into a place that you want to be? Not just working with an interior designer to make it look
yeah.
cool and great in a
Yes.
magazine spread, right? But what is preventing you from coming into the office? Because there are so many perks and benefits for working in a co-located workplace.
Yeah.
You and I are definitely some of the biggest champions of remote work that have ever existed. And here we are saying like, yeah, man,
Yeah.
there are some days that I would love to go into an office. Like that would be wonderful. So having conversations with your employees about conversations like that. What what can we provide that would make it better for you and easier for you to come in here and be more valuable, so that you as employees are getting a return on investment of your commute?
Yeah. Excellent. Great. Good. So we've got that. So we've looked at the workspace. Now let's look at some work practices and in particular some collaboration practices. You've actually got three that I've taken the liberty of clumping under the Working Out Loud banner, which are use public channels, digitize all resources, and repeat important announcements. Which one's your favorite? Which one do you want to expand on, Laurel, of those three?
They all kind of clump together because
Yes.
here's where they all come from. In an office, one of the greatest and primary channels of communication that we have is not explicit communication, it's implicit communication, it's observation, right? We just walk into the room and look around, and we are learning a whole lot about what's going on just from watching and listening. So we can see who's working on a project together. We can kind of understand the general temperature and status of that project. We can understand if there's kind of a buzz and an energy and a lot of people are chatting in the break room. That means there's a big announcement coming up. Like there's just little nuances to that observational opportunity that communicates so much to us. And when we don't have access to that as virtual workers, it actually creates an imbalance in informational accessibility, that the people that are on site have access to all of that information that they can implicitly learn, and the people that are offsite don't. And so already we're creating a disconnection in employee experience. So the more that we can pay attention to little teeny tiny habits in our communication that help replace that observational opportunity, then that helps equalize that experience of our hybrid teams. So if we are repeating information, so we're telling people that an announcement is coming up, we make the announcement, we remind them about it after, that's kind of replacing that experience of hearing about it in the break room, then attending the meeting, and then talking about it at somebody, afterward with somebody in the hallway. Same thing with using public channels on Slack or Microsoft Teams instead of direct messages or emails. That gives other people an opportunity to watch your conversation or kind of, eavesdrop on your conversation without actually participating in it so that they understand what you're working on and who you're working with and what the status of your project is. Same thing with dropping into project management tools and collaboration systems. That all of those are asynchronous opportunities for people to have that same observational opportunity. So you really strategically leaning into the tools that we use to stay connected as distributed and hybrid teams, and paying attention to not just what tools we're using, but how we're using them. That's the key to, I think, all three of those points that you mentioned.
Yeah, and it's been difficult as well because if you think people who are not used to working in this way and who were forced to work in this way, and
Mhm.
now we're going to see, okay, with the hybrid way, there's also some adjustment. And I think what you're mentioning is all ways of pulling back in a way from our spontaneous communication, by which I mean that we need to be a lot more aware of how our
Mhm.
communication's being structured rather
Yes.
than, okay, I'm just talking or I'm just saying this. Actually, yeah, I want to say this, but actually, who else might need to hear this? Where is the right place? And
Mhm.
that can feel so unnatural if you've never done it before. And I
Yes.
think that for for us who love communication and working in this way, it's really exciting to break down, and that's what we do. But for the people who are doing, whose job is not to pay attention to how they communicate, it's something I think that we haven't quite embraced and communicated enough, that it's that extra skill and this, maybe this extra thing we need to be doing.
hmm Absolutely. All of this is about intention. And most people feel resistant to it because they feel like, oh, this is so hard. Like, this is unnatural, just like you
Yeah.
said, right? This is unnatural. However, we have to remember that what feels natural actually isn't inherent in any way. It was intentional as well, but it was just the byproduct of hundreds of years of working in an office in a co-located environment together, that along the way we developed little teeny tiny strategies like lowering the office walls or the cubicle walls. We lowered those in the 80s and 90s so that people could see more and have more opportunity for observation. We started traditions like drive-bys of the managers so that they could have more quick and frequent agile touch points with their employees so that they could understand how they were doing before and after and between meetings. Like, they're little teeny tiny things that feel very natural, but they're not. Those were carefully constructed as well over time. Just because we have a longer history of them doesn't mean that they were ever organic or inherent. So now what we need to do is just understand that we are now in that same innovation process in a new environment. There are just as many ways to identify patterns and working styles and get emotional and more cognitive feedback from our employees. There are just as many ways to facilitate empathetic leadership and trust-based communication. Like, all of those can still exist, but it's going to require intention. So we can do this. We saw this in the pandemic, right? That
Yeah.
in 2020, all of these companies were like, well, how in the world do you develop culture? Like, and then, us that had been in the space for a while, we're like, well, you just have a party. Like, what are you talking about? Like, you just hang out together. And then all of a sudden they're like, oh, we can have a party. And then all the virtual happy hours just exploded way out of control. By the way, they took that way too far.
Too much.
Yeah, way too much.
That's all we do.
Yeah, exactly. So it's like, whoa, rein it in, guys, rein it in. But it's just those little tiny realizations of, no, we can recreate those experiences. They might look a little bit different than they did, but you just have to take the time and space to actually create that space in your virtual work environment. So yeah, slowly but surely people will realize that it's not as terrifying and unusual and unique as they feel like it is. It just requires a new mindset.
I love how you put it, the fact that we're innovating now. I think that is
Mm-hmm.
a much better phrasing than we've got to do it this way. I love it. I love that actually for anyone who's really wanting to champion new ways of working that will make remote work and hybrid work within that more sustainable. I think it's a really good way of putting it, that we need to innovate. We innovate in our products, we innovate in our processes, we innovate in our communication to the external world. Now we need to pay a bit more attention about innovating in how we are working
Mm-hmm.
together. It's quite an exciting, uplifting message.
Absolutely. Well, and also noticing too that the way that we were doing it before, that might feel more comfortable and familiar, but that doesn't mean that it was the right
Yeah.
way, right? So, I mean, productivity measurement is the classic example of that. People looked really busy in the office, but were we actually collecting accurate measurements about what they were producing? No, we were just paying attention to their presence, not to their productivity. So that was a problem that needed to be solved with or without remote work. That has been a problem for a long, long time. Now we are just being forced to innovate because we do not have the opportunity to monitor presence at all. I mean, without legal compliance issues. So yeah, it's like we have to think about different ways, period, just as our responsibility to be creative and innovative and not default to what is familiar and misinterpret that as correct.
Yeah. And so this it leads us, because I'm going to make it leads us to your last points, which I've clumped under. Well, the whole piece is about inclusivity, but I think these two specifically for me talk even more to
Mm,
inclusivity. And just something that you were saying now, I think that even when we're thinking of inclusivity, we need to think about that differently now, because as we were saying earlier, we've realized that we're different in a lot more ways that we've been used to thinking about, from how we like to communicate, where we're comfortable with other people, to little things like what's your favorite tool online. So all
mhm,
these differences, which before um, they were there, but maybe they weren't relevant. Maybe they weren't visible. Maybe we
mhm.
couldn't even have time to explore these differences. Now they're there. So your last points of diversifying company rituals and offering equal rewards, in addition to everything else, I think start to take us into this. This inclusivity is broad now.
This is absolutely one of the most common questions that I get asked during Q&A sessions after webinars and speaking events is, how in the world do we get introverts to participate in virtual calls? And I always have to give kind of an awkward response of saying, well, what did you do to get them to participate in meetings in the office?
Yeah.
And I just kind of reflected back on them and say, well, do it exactly what you were doing. And that's sometimes a very embarrassing and vulnerable moment for most managers, because they realize, oh, I wasn't doing anything in the office. So that's where we need to, again, take this opportunity to innovate and realize that, hey, what we were doing before may not have been the best choice. So what can we do in the virtual business world, in the physical business world, in our rituals, in our tools? How can we use this new space to do everything and anything better? And inclusion, I think, is a massive part of that, because we have so many ways of working in a virtual business environment, things like measuring productivity equally, like we talked about, using asynchronous communication, using project management systems. Because of those nuances of virtual operational infrastructures, they actually open the door for much, much wider diversity rates to be much stronger. So we see women in leadership roles and distributed teams at 40% higher than they are in in-person corporations and companies. Like, that's a staggering statistic. Same thing with minorities. Same thing with neurodiversity, because people have more cognitive processing time. They don't have to be quite as spontaneous and think on their feet as they do in a shared and synchronous environment. So there's so many opportunities to diversify our workforce and create, well, I should say, tear down the systems that have been holding certain demographics back. However, again, this is about how we're working. This is the key to everything. So here's this door that's wide open for diversity. It's up to us to walk through that door to turn those diversification opportunities into inclusion. So if we do not use these tools strategically, if we do not create the right rituals, if we do not train our managers to be more empathetic and emotionally intelligent leaders, then that diversity will never turn into true inclusion. We need to make sure that we are not just seeing those numbers rise, but making sure that all people of all backgrounds, all qualifications, all industries, all feel recognized, appreciated, valued, productive. That's what a truly inclusive culture is about.
Yeah. And I'm going to pitch in with something just here in this last point about inclusivity is that while we're looking and going right back to your very early points about socioeconomic change, and also you were talking a lot about flexibility rather than remote work at the beginning of the episode. And I think that this is also an important reminder that while our knowledge workers might be getting some flexibility and a lot of attention maybe at the moment of how to make their processes and their work better, that there might be people in the organization, especially the larger ones, that will not have flexibility in location. However, this inclusivity that you're speaking of is also about that. And so we've got to be looking after both sides of the workforce at the same time and rediscovering maybe what flexibility means for people who are not knowledge workers.
Absolutely. Remote work will cease to be a term in the next 5 years because remote work will just be work, right? So it's this whole movement, this whole revolution is about how we're working, not where we're working. So if we break that down and we say, okay, how are we working? Well, we're working with location flexibility, with geographic flexibility, with asynchronous communication, with global and standardized tools. You know, we break that down into smaller elements of how are we working in a way that is different. Then those individual components are much more easy to adapt to a variety of different industries and working environments. I love what I'm seeing for very empathetic and innovative companies in the manufacturing industries, because they're saying, well, whoa, if we allow all of our office workers to, work from anywhere overnight, and all of our manufacturing workers are stuck in factory, that's just going to make that gap between blue collar and white collar workers that much wider. Like that we can't do that. So I love when they're coming to us as consultants saying, what can we do? And we break that down into, well, is there a way that we can offer certain workers or certain departments more schedule flexibility? Or is there a way that we can give them access to the same, digital handbooks and tools and documentation systems that we have for the distributed teams? Give them access too, so that we all are using the same company resources and have more information accessibility for all of those different layers of workers. So when we break it down into those ways of working, that's where we can see the true standardization and just expansion of what it means to participate in the future of work.
Yeah, thanks for that. So we've covered adjust productivity tracking, standardized meeting experience. Well, listeners, go and look and read the article and bookmark it and use it almost as a checklist. But before we wrap up, you've already started to bring in some of what you're seeing in these larger organizations, because of course it's always distributed organizations, remote work has always been seen as relatively easy to adopt in smaller organizations. However, now we are asking larger organizations to consider it. So I just wonder whether, before we wrap up, whether you could share with us either a company you've been working on and how they've been changing as they approach hybrid, or something you've heard, just a little bit to bring that, to wrap it all up.
Yeah. So to clarify exactly what Distribute does, we are responsible for virtual organizational development. So that is helping the companies that are exploring higher levels of flexibility, actually helping them convert operations from physical to virtual. So we're helping them, evaluate their tools and build software toolkits. We're helping them write handbooks. We're helping them write policies. We're helping them, create training systems and programs. Like that's what we're doing, is that really unsexy change management process. But we love it.
But you make it sound wonderful, so that's okay.
So there's that.
Well, you love it.
Yeah, I do. So in all of that analysis and construction and of the change management process, something that we really love, and a conversation that has been happening more often lately that we are really celebrating, is that measurement of success metrics. And this comes back to our conversation before about these leaders that are feeling cornered into this, and they just say like, oh, why are we doing this? Because the people are asking for it. Like, oh, that's not enough of a reason. And I agree. I come from an entire career of being a COO, and I completely agree that just a workforce opinion is not enough of a motivator to actually facilitate change. We need to be able to see how this is benefiting the organization. So that's my favorite conversation to have. And I'm so excited that more employers are ready to have this conversation as well, is how do we measure success? How do we actually know if hybrid working is benefiting our company? How do we know if we're getting a return on this investment? And we will know in 6 months to a year to 2 years if this risk or this terrifying chance that we took was actually worth it. And we can use internal data in financial reporting and in engagement survey data. We can prove that there is organizational value to this. So that's the conversation that I want everybody to be thinking about as they are considering and often feeling pressured into becoming a hybrid team, is to understand that there is a right way and a wrong way to do this, but we're only going to know if it's the right way or the wrong way for our organization if we are measuring data. So that if anybody wants help doing that, please have them reach out to me. But at the very least, it can just be a conversation with your senior leadership team to say, what are our goals here? What outcomes are we trying to see from this? And how will we know if and when we have achieved them?
Yeah, so going back as well to change management as we know it, to some of the ways in which we look at this business as we know it, it's just this context a bit different, but we can use the same language to measure it as well. Yeah, excellent. So listeners, distributeconsulting.com. Of course, we'll put the link in the show notes if you want to get in touch with Laurel. Laurel, you also do speaking. So listeners, if you want Laurel to come and speak to your people, then you still do speaking, webinars, everything, don't you?
Yes, absolutely. Both virtual and physical, which is fun to do again. Yes. Fun to be back on the speaking circuit and getting back on planes every once in a while. That's it's been a long 2 years, hasn't it?
Yes. So distributeconsulting.com. And also, if you want to check out episode 212, which is all about remote work for social change, 189, Laurel talks about information isolation. And also we have the whole connection and disconnection series from 2021. Laurel, anything you want to say to our listeners before we wrap up?
No, this has been a fabulous conversation. Thank you so much for having me, and for, as always, for your wonderful thoughts as well. I just love advocating the good cause with you.
Excellent. I am privileged to have a show, because every time I have a conversation, especially with people who are just so much more articulate than I am, and my mind just starts to race, and it's like, oh yeah, and then my brain explodes. So, listeners, we would love to hear your thoughts. You can find the contact form over at virtualnotdistant.com. My email, if you prefer that form of communication, is pilar@virtualnotdistant.com. And once more, if you want to check out Laurel, check out distributeconsulting.com. A big thank you for listening to the 21st Century Work-Life podcast produced by Virtual Not Distant. If you have something to add to the conversation, let us know through the contact form over at virtualnotdistant.com. I have been your host, Pilar Orti, and I'm signing off now. Wherever you are, whatever you're doing, enjoy.